All right. Oh, I already have lost 5 seconds. So I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Wisby because I often talk about quantum ethics. And today I will be pushed a little bit out of my comfort zone. So quantum ethics will be the moral foundation of global quantum governance. And what I want to start thinking about, and I think is timely, is how we can translate these moral principles into effective global governance. So in some way, how we can move beyond quantum nationalism, embrace that to some extent, but then take that and apply it into a global framework. So brief introduction. I did not come from the quantum physics space, although I have now, do not have a PhD. Strangely, came from the software world. EeroQ is a purely hardware company. We were founded in 2016. And about 1 year after our founding, I became quite concerned about this technology because for all of the reasons that I was excited as an entrepreneur about the financial opportunity and the vastness of that opportunity, as Professor Morton said, I realized that there were potentially equally or greater implications for harm. So I have a few controversial statements today. One is that Dr. Wisby is 100% right that the ship has sailed. Quantum computers will be built. I think in an ideal world, perhaps they shouldn't be, which is quite strange to hear from someone who would stand to profit from them. But I think these machines potentially will be so powerful that there really is no parallel other than of effective governance of humans over such a powerful technology. I think nuclear is the closest, and I'll go about that a bit later. I agree also that the nascent phase of quantum computing is both the right time to think about ethics and now governance. And a question that I'm often asked, in addition to, is quantum ethics unique, is, well, this is too early. We don't yet know what quantum computers will be capable of. And that's absolutely true. We really do not yet know what all of the applications will be. We have some idea about the positive applications, which are, really excitingly discovering new medicines. Batteries is another great example. Quantum computing will not solve climate change, but it can potentially play an important role. On the other hand, breaking encryption, as well as the fact that some folks who are nefarious actors may have access to this technology, is also something to be considered. And again, we know that breaking RSA encryption is a negative impact of quantum technology, but there may be many others still that we have yet to know about. So I'm going to talk about that little part in Dr. Wisby's graph of the regulation question. So, I think the time to do so is now, and global regulation involves, a few different areas. It's not simply global governance as well. It's not simply regulating, you can do this and you cannot do that. It also means investment, R&D, to advance quantum computing in a cohesive way, not only nationally, but ideally internationally. And while we're never going to get pure cooperation, and some of the recent news has illustrated that there really is, not a way to get every country in the world to work together, that would be naive. We do have some examples of how we can get, countries to, as many as possible, to establish frameworks of governance. So, first, you might be wondering, why we have to make a unique framework for quantum computing. And can we not just apply AI governance? Well, there really isn't such a thing as AI governance, which would be my second controversial statement. There are many papers that float around the world about AI ethics. There are many conferences. And yet, there really is no cohesive global or even national regulation of AI. And I also will leave this session with more questions and answers, because I know that this is something that we need to be talking about, but because quantum computing has so many unknown applications, similar with AI, that creates the challenge of not really being able to create effective governance because, again, we don't know what the applications are. But there's a hodgepodge in AI of different governance models, and there's nothing cohesive. So to think about this for quantum, I believe we have to take a somewhat fresh approach, or at least a similar approach that some are taking with AI, but more cohesive. So there are 3 steps to global governance. There are norms, there are standards, and there are laws and regulations. And all of these areas intertwine with each other. And sometimes a regulation, ideas can start as regulation and then become a norm. Sometimes norms can emerge to standards or regulations. So norms are the standards and practices of users, developers, and stakeholders. And there are many stakeholders in quantum computing. And this is something that I think we need to collectively recognize. The quantum computing industry is rather insular. And because quantum computing sounds so scary and it's so technical, which it is, there is a problem in getting broader engagement from folks in the field, folks who, quite frankly, might be capable of understanding the applications as they emerge, but don't really want to get involved in the field as a result. So there is one example for recombinant DNA of what I think is one of the most effective examples of creating norms. And this was the Asilomar Conference in 1975, which brought together folks, not only practitioners in recombinant DNA, but also folks from across the world in law, policy, bioethics, and more. So this was one example of how we can effectively bring in more stakeholders, but the quantum field has to frankly, be a little bit more welcoming and do a better job of explaining really how this works, which folks like OQC are doing already, but we need to embrace that. So there are 3 stages of developing a norm. There's an emergence, there is a cascade, and there is adoption and internalization. And this is traditionally the path through which we develop governance, is starting with norms. So the norm emerges from customs and practices, and then it becomes a cascade, which essentially is what it sounds like. It means that more and more folks become aware of the norm. And then finally, we get to the stage of standardization and internalization. So there are 2 ways that a norm can become a standard or a law. They can be formalized by declaring them a law, and we'll talk about how that can apply to multiple countries in a second, or they can change existing law. So we already have some existing global frameworks and treaties that could simply be used to include quantum computing. I'll talk briefly about the concept of peremptory norms, which are essentially norms that are so fundamental that they are unanimously agreed upon and often become law. So one fun example is piracy, literal pirates, not downloading things. And this emerged as a peremptory norm, and then, through UN charters, have, become standard regulations. The second stage, and again, these are not always in order, but generally speaking, the second stage are standards. And their standards are often thought of as technical standards developed by organizations like NIST or the European Commission for Standardization. And they can indeed be technical. For example, in the United States, NIST is developing standards for quantum cryptography. So what this means is that we do indeed have defense against quantum computers breaking RSA encryption, and we're working on a technical standard for that. The adoption of this will be quite challenging, but standards can also be ethical and moral. And this is an open question that I don't have answers to because we are at the very, very beginning of this. And standards are essentially the middle ground. So one of our advisors wrote a piece in The Hill that noted that China in particular is very, very focused on standardization. And they are trying to essentially set the global standard. And that's, fine if any one country wants to do that. But ultimately, we believe that this should be not that the norms and standards should not be defined by any one country or any one institution, company, again, going back to the diagram that Dr. Wisby presented. And then the final source are laws. And so these are, can be treaties. One of the most well-known is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT, where you can get a large amount of countries to agree to a binding law. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone will follow it, but there are examples of powerful technologies that have been essentially, governed and regulated. And these are binding, which means that they have specific consequences, which norms and standards do not necessarily have. So finally, then the question becomes what is the framework to think about this? And this remains an open question that, I think we should leave the audience with to think about. We can use, the first thing to use is broad and multiple stakeholders. So bringing more people from outside of the quantum computing field into the dialogue, helping them understand what the technology both could be used for currently and may be used for in the future. And these could be regulators of other technologies, they could be lawyers, they could be ethicists, they could be journalists. It's really something that involves everyone. And again, building on what Dr. Wisby said, we need to make this field, more inclusive and more diverse, not, merely in terms of race or gender, but also in terms of people that are thinking about this, because often the folks that are in the lab or working in companies are thinking primarily about the technology. And I won't say who this is, but one of the folks at our company, who's a hardware engineer, when I first met him, I asked him, what applications of quantum computing he was most excited about. And he couldn't name a single one. And he's a world-class expert in our technology. And again, I don't want to make this identifying, so I'll say he spent more than 10 years working on our type of technology to build quantum computers. And here I also agree with Professor Morton that silicon should be the foundation of a quantum computer, which we use. We just add a layer of liquid helium on top of it. That is another matter. But I also agree that building CMOS-compatible quantum computers is a very viable way forward. But point being, he hadn't even thought about it. And some folks who work in the field have, and some haven't. So that is why it is so critical to create a broader and more inclusive dialogue, to think about norms, standards, and regulations. And what I will close with is the natural question is, what should come first? And in history, there has not been a clear answer. Sometimes norms have been the foundation, sometimes through broad agreement. So one example could be that I believe we could already consider it a norm that RSA encryption should not purposefully be broken by any one actor. This is something that I would argue is an existing norm that should be made into a regulation via something like the UN Charter. But we don't know the exact pathway through which it will develop. So we need to create an open dialogue, and we don't know where to start. But once we begin the dialogue, we will be able to find a way to get global governance on this technology.